Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Gary Hibner here, and this is the MIDI Guru Guide on Cubase. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what Cubase is capable of with MIDI. We'll start off with the basics by looking at things like MIDI velocity, quantization, then moving through into control change messages like modulation, expression, aftertouch. Then we'll dabble into the MIDI modifiers and see what they're capable of with the randomization of note positions and velocity, and how we can just take a performance and make it more expressive. We're going to take a look at different types of editing techniques with multiple MIDI layers at a time, or looking at multiple instruments and how we can work with multiple instruments with one MIDI track. Then we'll move over and take a look at multi-timbral instruments and multi-outputs, also at the drum editor and drum maps. Then finally, we'll finish off at looking at key changing, program change, and expression maps and how you can set these up and use them. So now that you know where we're headed, let's jump in and see where to start. Now in this video, let's take a look at CC1, which is modulation. Now CC stands for control change, and it's a message that's sent and embedded into the MIDI data that doesn't pertain to the notes and the velocity. So for example, I got the string patch over here. I'm just going to click and open it and just play back from here. Now it's very soft. Now watch as I increase the mod wheel on my MIDI controller. And bring it down. And then back up again. Now if I open up the instrument, you'll see that it's using Native Instruments String Ensemble Symphony Essentials library. And as I move my mod wheel, it's moving this dynamics dial here. So what you heard there is you heard the dynamics increasing and decreasing as I was moving this mod wheel. So I'm just going to position this over here and play back again. So low dynamics, and then increase the dynamics. So on this instrument, modulation or CC1 is controlling the dynamics. So it's important to note that modulation can be assigned to any parameter. So for example, if I just go to another instrument, over here, I've got an instance of pad shop. Now I'm going to play it back and watch as I adjust the mod wheel. So on this instrument, the mod wheel is altering or changing the filter attack and the grain duration. So when you see CC1 modulation, this doesn't pertain to modulation effects. It's pertaining to the mod wheel on your controller. So that's assigned to CC1. And then depending on what instrument you're using and how it's been set up, that is what is going to be adjusted with the mod wheel. Now, speaking of modulation, let's say I record in some modulation to this strings track over here. So I'm just going to hit record and I'm going to change my mod wheel while I play back. And then you can see how the modulation is recorded onto the track. So there you can see the modulation. And it's just a great way for this instrument to add some dynamics and improve the performance. So what it did there is it created two events. Now I can select both these events by just lassoing around and just right clicking and going to my glue tool and gluing them together. So now I've got one event which includes my MIDI note data. You can see the velocity. Then if I click this button here, I can choose to show the modulation. So I'm adding another lane over here to view my MIDI data. So these are all the types of MIDI messages you can see. For example, you can see the velocity, and then whatever has these sort of black diamond dots next to it is lanes or data that has been edited. So I'm going to click over there and I see two lanes. I see my velocity and I see my modulation, and I can change the heights of each of these lanes. So I can either record in my CC1 note data changes, or I can use my pen tool. So I can just right click here and draw it in. So I've got two ways. I can either record it in real time, or I can go in and draw it in afterwards and make changes. And like you saw with the velocity, I can also use these different line tools to change how I draw things in. So you've got control of drawing in exactly how you want this modulation to look. But just what I want to show you in this video is that CC1 or control change 1 is assigned to the modulation parameter. And the modulation parameter is different depending on the instrument that it's using. So for example, in this strings instrument, the CC1 was assigned to the dynamics on the instrument, where with this pad shop, the CC1 was assigned to a filter and a grain duration. So it really just depends on how the instrument's been built and what's been mapped to CC1. But you can also go into an instrument at a later stage, and if you've got the ability, you can go in and edit what the modulation is editing. So for example, on this instrument here, I've got this matrix window over here, and I can choose what the modulation is going to alter. So the source is the mod wheel. I can choose how much of that is being applied. And then from here are the parameters on the synth that I can use the mod wheel to edit. So that is CC1 and modulation. Now in the next video, I want to start talking about expression and the difference between expression and modulation. So in this video, I want to show you the list editor view. Now I did show you this in a previous video, but let's get into some more detail. So I've got this drum part over here. It goes like this. And this is playing over those strings and pads that I had from the previous video. So let's use the drums as an example. I'm going to select that event, then I'm going to go to the MIDI menu, and then go down to List Editor. Now this lists all the notes that are in that event. And it looks slightly different because it's running linearly, and you're not seeing the lanes of each note. For example, you're not seeing the kick and the snare and the hats. It's just listing the notes and the control changes linearly as it goes through the changes. So starting at the top here, you've got your type. So this is either a note or controller. The start of that point, the end, the length of it. Data 1 is the pitch or the control change message that's being used. And then data 2 is other things, for example, like velocity. So for example, this first note, this is a kick. And that kick is pitch is C1 and the velocity is 98. And what I really like about this view is you can make some quick changes to all your note data. For example, if I select all my notes, and I go to data 2, which is 98, which is 98 for the kick of the velocity, I can type 50. But watch what this is going to do. It's not going to change all of them to 50. It's going to change each note respectively. So keep an eye on here, and I hit like that, and there we go. So it's dropped the velocities accordingly depending on how I've set the first parameter. And as well, this value here is also to do with velocities. So if I undo the changes, you can see the velocities there. So that means that I can also go here and draw in changes. So I can draw in value changes for all my MIDI note data and control change data right here in this editor. Now I find that's a really, really handy trick. Another thing you can do is also quickly change the pitch. So let's undo that. Let's go to another event. So let's say, for example, I go to these strings and this is in D. And I want to change the pitch. Maybe I want to shift it up a semitone. So I'm going to select that event, go to MIDI, then List Editor, and then I can select all my notes. And this is the pitch for my first note. Where is it? We're over here. So there you see A3. Now I can take that and pitch that up. So I can go here and I can say a sharp 3. And then that's going to shift up any other notes that I've got selected. Obviously, these are all control change messages, but it's very clever in that it sees that I'm changing the pitch and changes the pitch accordingly for all the other notes that I've got selected. So really explore this window. We'll get into more detail on it through the video, but basically you can use this as a very quick way to change or edit parameters and note data and velocities for all your notes within an event. This is different than expression that is a CC change message. So for example, if I just open up expression and I draw in some data here, for example, an amplitude increase from here to here, basically what's happening is all these MIDI notes are being increased by the setting that's set in CC11, which is the expression. But this is very different from what is called note expression. Now, with note expression, if you click on your inspector, you can see you've got this option here that shows you note expression. Now, what you can do is you can take these parameters and edit it on a note by note basis. So, for example, you can take this note and increase its volume, but these notes over here don't. So it's not like where you're drawing in some changes to the MIDI note data and it's happening across all the notes within that range. What you're doing is you're able to make changes to just that note using the parameters that you've got set up here. So let me show you how that's done. So first off, what you want to do is you're just going to right click here and make sure that you're showing the note expression data. And then this gives you this little icon over here. So that means when you make any changes or add some note expression, we're going to be able to see those. And also what you want to do is have this clicked. Now what this means is if you just hover over here, it says if you double click a note, it's going to open up the note expression editor. So let's say on these chords over here, I want to take this note over here and I want to change its volume. So I'm going to select volume and I'm just going to make sure I've got my arrow tool selected. That's always easier. And then I'm going to double click on here and it opens up this little box over here that is the expression editor. Now, what I can do is I can draw in changes. So let's say I'm going to draw in with the line tool from here up to the top over here, and that's going to be my note change. So what we got is we've got volume that's increasing over time from a softer volume up to there. Now, if I just click off here, you can see now that there's some data that relates to that note, and that's the expression note data. So for example, if I click over here, it's going to hide any note expression, and when I click here again, I can see it. So now if I play back, you can hear that that note is going to increase in volume. So that might be a bit subtle, so let's maybe do something a bit more drastic. How about changing the tuning? So I'm going to select the tuning, and I'm going to double click that note as well. It opens up the expression editor, and I'm going to do a slight pitch drift from about here to the beginning. So now that's going to create a volume increase and a pitch up. So it's going to go from a low pitch up to a higher pitch. Now take a listen. Did you hear that? Let's make it even more drastic. So I'm going to double click there again. And I'm going to go from a low tuning. Let's actually get the line tool. A low tuning all the way up to a super high tuning. And if I want to change the volume, I can jump back to the volume over here. And maybe I want to increase that volume as well. So I'm going to just draw in a louder volume. Now if I jump back and take a listen. Let's check out some of the other things. So maybe on this chord over here, I want to change the cutoff. So you can see you've got some parameters here. So I'm going to go to cutoff and I'm going to double click this note and I'm going to draw in a cutoff. Let's maybe draw something like that. And then I'm going to hit off. Then for this note, I'm going to do a cutoff going the other way. So the cutoff is going to be going in different directions depending on what is set up in each note. So we got something like this. Very interesting. Maybe as well, we want to edit the resonance. So that is the cutoff. I'll select the resonance, double click that, and make this go in the reverse direction. The same for this, click that. Use the line tool, make that go in the opposite direction. And what you probably heard is a volume increase. So what I'm going to do is go to volume and then just make a slight decrease in volume. So we're going to start the volume here and just slightly decrease it. Likewise, the same for this note over here. So you can see it's very easy to do, just making these changes. And you get some very interesting results that you wouldn't otherwise get if you weren't using note expression. One last thing, let's say on these last notes, let's take a look at if we use panning. So I'm going to take these lower notes, pan them to the left, and these higher notes and pan them to the right. Let's try that out and see how it works. So this is going to be panned to this side. So this is the left, as well as this. Let's pan that, maybe not as wide. Then jumping over to these are going to be panned to the other side. So that's going to be not as wide, where this one is going to be a lot wider. So let's take a listen now. So we've got a pitch shift with a volume increase. We've got some cutoff and resonance changes on these two chords. And then we've got a wide chord where the two low notes are going to be to the one side and the high notes to the other side. So as you can hear, you can do some really interesting things with note expression. And when you don't need to see that data anymore, you can just click there, remove it, carry on and edit your MIDI if you want to see it like this, or if you need to go back, you can click there and view that data. So a very powerful feature. It does depend on what the instrument can do. So I am using an instance of Retrolog here, which supports note expression. And when I go to the note expression, so I click on that event and go over here to the note expression little section under the inspector, I can see what parameters I can use the editing of the note expression on. So we're going to start at the basics and just start explaining MIDI note data and MIDI velocity. And then throughout the video series, we're going to expand on that and show you some more advanced features with MIDI. So what you've got is an instrument track, and on an instrument track is a MIDI part. So you've got this little block over here that has some notes that's showing you the MIDI input note data that's been recorded into Cubase. So for example, you've got maybe a MIDI controller keyboard plugged in, or you're using the draw tool and you're creating these blocks and drawing in the MIDI note data. Now, if I double click this, this is going to bring up the editor window where we've got this piano roll view, which is showing us the pitch note data, and then we're seeing all the notes that have been input into this block. So for example, I've got a kick on C1, a snare on D1, and then these hats on F sharp 1. Now, what you'll notice if I just play this back, it sounds very unnatural and robotic. For example, if I jump to this other MIDI performance over here and play this back, it's more varied and dynamic because there's some changes within the MIDI note velocity. So changing up your MIDI note velocity is going to give you a better MIDI performance. But before getting into velocity, let's just first talk about the MIDI notes. So when you record or input in a MIDI note, so I'm just going to draw a MIDI note over there. So I've got a MIDI note there. Basically, what you're telling Cubase is that this is a start of a MIDI note and it's at this pitch. So pitch is value 1 of MIDI, where velocity is MIDI value 2. So that's just two important things to understand. For example, if I go to the MIDI menu and then open up the list editor, this gives you a breakdown of all the MIDI notes within the MIDI event. And what I want you to see here is data 1, which is value 1. So you've got a MIDI note, it's giving you the pitch. Then data 2 is the velocity for that note, and that's giving you the data amount for the velocity. Now, don't worry too much about this window. We are going to get into more detail on it later in the video series, but I just wanted to show you that there's a difference between your MIDI note, which is the pitch, and then the data for the velocity. So moving back to velocity, I just want to close this down and I want to go to this drum part over here where it's got these sort of static velocity amounts or set velocity amounts. So all these velocity amounts are at 100. And there's ways that you can go in and edit your velocity. So let me show you that. So if I use my arrow selector tool and just select around all these MIDI notes, so I've selected all those MIDI notes there. Here, I've got the selection of velocities. If you're not seeing this velocity pane, you can just click this plus sign here and choose to show it. For example, you've got other types of lanes you can show, But for now, we're focusing in on velocity. Now, on this block over here, you can edit your velocity. If I go over here and move this, this is going to drop the velocity of all the selected notes. Now, if I play back, it's way softer. And if I bring it back up, it's going to be way louder. So maybe the first misconception is that velocity has to do with loudness. So the softer your velocity, the softer the notes, then the higher the velocity, the louder the notes. Now, this is sort of correct, but it really depends on the instrument. Now, the best way of thinking about velocity is controlling the dynamics of an instrument. So as you drop the velocity on notes, it's dropping the dynamics. And then as you increase them up, you got high dynamics. Because you do have a separate control for MIDI volume. So you just don't want to get confused between the two. Now, the next thing to point out is that MIDI has a range. So you've got a range of 0 all the way at the bottom, and then all the way at the top, you've got a range of 127. So your range for MIDI notes is from 0 to 127. And also on this block over here, you can draw in your MIDI note data. So if I go like this, I'm drawing in and changing the velocity amounts. And as you can see, this color shows a change of velocity. Now, you're seeing this. So up over here, I've chosen to show the velocity amounts in color. If I chose that, it's going to show my pitches in different color. So all my snares are the same color, all my kicks are the same color, and all my hats are the same. But I really like showing velocity because I can get a very clear indication of when something is very red, it's got a high velocity, and when it goes down to sort of the more purple and blue, it's got a low velocity. Now, obviously, drawing in here is not great because I'm changing the velocity of all the types of parts in this drum part. If I just undo that, and let's say I just select just the hats, I can lasso around them like that. Now I've got just the hats, and I can drop the level of just the hats. So you can see that they are my kick and snares, and they are my hats. What you can also do with my hats still selected, you've got different points on the selection. I can use this to tilt the hats. So now the hats are going to slightly increase in velocity. Or I could tilt it the other way. With this knob over here, I can tilt them. So that's quite handy. You can select specific things. Maybe you've got like a snare roll. You could select them and then just tilt them to have an increase in velocity. Very handy. Now, over here, if I just select everything again, you've got this option over here, and it seems like it's sort of dropping the velocity and increasing it. But what it's really doing is compressing and expanding it. So to demonstrate this a bit more clearly, I'm just going to zoom in and I'm going to go to each note. So if I select a note, I can change the velocity over here. So I've selected that note. I'm just going to drop the velocity. So I'll drop that, and let's say I'll take that as well, drop that. Now, this is obviously a very tedious and time-consuming process doing it like this, but I will show you faster ways of doing things soon. So that's there, and I'm just going to speed through and change the rest. Okay, so I've gone in there and changed the velocity for all the hats. So if I just lasso around those hats, you can see if I adjust the volume level, I'm increasing the level. Now, what this does is it adds compression or expansion. So if I jump this up, the higher notes go up higher, and the low notes go lower. Vice versa, if I drop the other way, it's going to compress them a bit more. So just don't get the two confused. This is dealing with compression and expansion, where this is just dealing with increasing the level up or down. So this is really nice if you just got a sort of hats part over here and you want to increase the dynamics between them. You can do that, for example, maybe jump it up, jump it down, and you've got flexibility working between the two. Another thing you can also do is when you're selecting your notes, you can also use your tools up here to edit the velocity. For example, I can use my line tool and draw in a line. So I'm editing the velocities there, or I could use my draw tool, manually draw them in, or even choose from a selection of other types of line. So I could go for a parabola and have that sort of increased curve shape, or maybe I want to go for a sine wave, and you've got the flexibility of drawing those in. So make use of these helpful tools when you're drawing in your velocities. Now, one more thing I just want to show you with velocities is Like you saw, I selected a note and then I changed it. Now, an easier way of adjusting a note's velocity is selecting a note, then holding down Command and Shift or Control and Shift, and you get that little speaker icon. And then there you can adjust the velocity. And you see a readout on the note, and you see in the lane below the velocity band changing. Now, where this is really, really handy is if you've got a chord on an instrument. So let me jump to another MIDI part. So I've got this piano part over here. I'm just going to select it. And let's say I take all these notes. So I've got all these notes here, and I'm just going to snap them to the grid. So we've got all these MIDI notes here. So they're all on the grid. Now, the problem is, if I go down here and I draw, I don't know which notes I'm actually adjusting. So as I jump it up, it's only increasing that note. But what if I want to increase this note? So that's really where this other tool comes in handy. Hold down Command or Control and Shift, and you can jump onto each note and adjust each one's velocity. So that is how you can edit your velocities with your MIDI note data. That's just giving you sort of groundwork, and you'll see as you get into future videos how you can use velocity as a tool to increase the performance and dynamic of your MIDI. In this video, let's take a look at how we can use MIDI tracks with instrument tracks. Now, back in previous versions, you used to add an instrument to a rack, and then you'd create MIDI tracks and map those tracks or route those MIDI tracks to the particular instrument. So that was the old way of doing things, where you'd have to have a rack and then you'd have to have MIDI tracks. Now, when you create an instrument track, this has got the instrument track housed on it, and then on it are the MIDI events. But you can actually still work with MIDI tracks and use it in quite a way to improve your workflow. For example, in this track over here, I've just got a single instrument track using an instance of Hellion with a drum set on, and then I've got my MIDI events. And in my MIDI events, I've got my kick, snare, and hats. But what if I want to separate the hats and the snare and the kick out onto different tracks? Well, if I had to do that with instrument tracks, I'd have to create 3 different instrument tracks, and then on those instrument tracks, have the same instance of the instruments, and then map the different parts to the different events. But you can actually do it quite easily with MIDI tracks and then routing them back to the instrument. So under Project, I'm going to go to Add Track, and I'm going to add a MIDI track. So for this, I can choose the MIDI track count. I'm going to say 3 because I need 1 for the kick, snare, and the hats, and I'm going to leave the name blank. So this creates 3 MIDI instrument tracks for me. One thing I just need to change is I need to change where these tracks are going to and the MIDI channel. So for this one, I'm going to label it kick, and this is going to be going to the Hellion instrument that's set correctly over there. And then for the MIDI channel, I want to set to MIDI channel 1 because I'm not using multi MIDI channels. I'm just using one MIDI channel on here, but I'm routing MIDI tracks to that instrument. The same for here. This is going to be snare. I'm going to change the channel to MIDI channel 1. This is also going to the Hellion instrument. And then this is the hats. Same, this is going to the Hellion instrument, and I can change the MIDI channel. I can also see the MIDI channel here, so I can just click on there and change it back to 1. Now, for example, if I take this MIDI event and drag it here, just onto the kick track, just to test it out, it is going to play. Now what I want to do is copy this to the other tracks, so that MIDI event to the other tracks. Then I can go into each one, and this is the kick, so I'm just going to remove everything else that I don't need. It's just the kicks there. The same for this. I'm going to go in. That's the hats. That's the snare over there, so I'm going to remove the kicks and the hats. And likewise for the same, I can go to this part and remove the snares and the kicks. I can also select each event and rename it. So that's going to be hats. This is going to be snare. And then this is going to be kick. And these are all mapped to the Hellion instrument. Now, what I like about this workflow is if I want to go in and just edit the kicks, I can go in here. So let's say I don't need that kick, I can just remove it. If I need to change the velocities, I can do that. And if I need to go into the hats, I can go there select them or do what I need to them. Maybe I just want to select these parts over here and reduce the velocity just for that section. So what I'm not having to do is having to go into one event and then selecting just the hats and editing them. I've got a separate event for each specific thing in the drums, for the kick, the snares, and the hats. They go into respective MIDI tracks, and then those MIDI tracks are being routed out to the instrument. So I find that's quite a nice way to work if you just want to separate things. For example, with these strings, I could do the same thing. If you look here, I've got different notes. I could maybe separate the low notes going to one MIDI channel and then the other higher notes going to another MIDI channel. So it all just depends on your workflow, but particularly with drums, I find this is a really nice way to work where I can create MIDI tracks and then route them to the instruments. In this video, let's take a look at how you can edit multiple parts together in the key editor. So for example, if I double click this part or events over here, it's going to open up in the key editor and I can go in and make the relevant changes that I need to. But if I select multiple parts and then double click them, it'll open up and show or reveal all those parts within one key editor. For example, I've got this bass part selected. I'm going to hold down Command or Control and select the piano, the pads, and the bell melody as well. And if you double click an event, it'll reveal all those parts within one key editor. Now, obviously, the benefit of this is that you can zoom into your performance and make sure that everything is playing in the right key. Now, if I zoom in, I can see that I've got a bass part that's playing incorrectly at bar 29, but I'll come back to that in a second. First, we need to know how we can differentiate between which part is which. Now, I can do that by looking at the events color here. Currently, I've got it set to velocity, meaning notes with the high velocity are going to be darker red color, and things with the low velocity are going to be more blue. Now, if I change the event colors to parts, that means each part will be a different color. So, for example, my bass track is going to be in red, and if I look at some of my other tracks here, this bell melody, that will be in the sort of light green color. So by just doing that and showing the event colors in parts, I can now differentiate and see which is each track. Now, there's obviously other benefits as well with having all your parts like this and being able to edit them. Then you just need to make sure if you click over here that edit all parts is ticked. And then if I hit Control A or Command A, I've got all my parts selected. And then I can go in and raise the velocities for all those parts. Or maybe I want to shift everything up 2 semitones. I can just shift that up and there we go. Or shift them back down again. Now, what happens if you just want to edit one part? So like I mentioned, at bar 29 over here, I've got an incorrect bass note playing over there. So if I just zoom in again, I need that bass part to be played over there. Now I could just move it, but let's just say, for example, you want to edit just on one track. So for example, if I go over here and select this, it's going to select anything that I've selected there and move it up. But I don't want to do that. I just want to work with the bass track. So then what you need to do is you need to go here, first select the part that you want to edit. So I want to edit the bass. It's showing me all the bass parts. Then over here, you need to select edit active part. Now what that means is, let me just zoom out. Now what this means is if I hit Control A or Command A, it's only going to select the bass notes. So let's say I just want to change the velocity of just the bass notes. Then I can select just the bass by hitting Command A and then go in and change the velocity just for those bass bars. Likewise, I want to edit this note and I want to make sure that I'm not selecting any other notes. It's just the bass. And then I can drag this up here. So I'll put it in the right place. So there you can see that's the benefits of using the multi-part editor, where you can either choose to edit all the parts together, or you can choose to edit just the active parts by making sure that you select each part that you want to edit, and then you can go in there and edit them. So it really is a time saver working this way, and you get a very good eye of seeing if everything is in key in your arrangement. In this video, I want to show you how you can use the MIDI modifiers to modify your MIDI performances. And in particular, how you can sort of shift the velocities and the starting points of your MIDI note data to give it a bit more of a human feel. So for example, I've got 2 instrument tracks here, one of drums. If I just go to the drums MIDI event, it's quite simple and straight with all the notes on the same velocity. Likewise, if I go to this synth lead part over here, the synth is playing a single note and the velocity is all the same. So let's see what we can do with the MIDI modifiers. I'm going to start off with these drums. So with the instrument track selected, I can go to the MIDI inserts And from here, I can add the MIDI modifier. Another thing to point out is that I'm using the MIDI modifiers as a MIDI inserts effect. Now, there is a MIDI modifier section. If you don't see it, you can click here and choose to view the modifiers, and you can go here and add the same thing. And you can see that this MIDI modifier section here looks exactly the same as the MIDI modifier and the MIDI inserts. As a preference, I just like using the MIDI inserts effect because I can bypass them and then freeze them like I'll show you later in this video. But you can do the same thing in the MIDI modifier section over here. Now, on this MIDI modifier, you can see that you can transpose the pitch, you can shift the velocities, compress the lengths, and then add in some randomization or filter the range. I want to show you how you can use these randomizers and how you can use them to randomize the position of the start of your MIDI notes and randomize the velocity. So, for example, if I just play back this drums, let's isolate it and listen to it. It's quite straight and robotic, so I want to randomize the velocities to give this a bit more of a natural feel. So I'm going to go to random and choose velocity, and then I can set the minimum range and the maximum range. So for this, I'm going to set it to -30 for the minimum and then for 30 for the max. Now, the MIDI note data is going to stay exactly the same, but this MIDI insert effect is going to modify the MIDI note data. Now take a listen. Can you hear the changes there? So I'm going to bypass this. This was it before. Very straight. And then now with the modifier. So that's working quite nicely. What I really like is how it's used on the hats, but in particular, I don't want to modify the velocities of my kick and snare. So what I'm going to do over here is create a MIDI track. For this, I'm going to call it hats. And what I want to do is remove the hats from this MIDI performance and just keep the kick and snare over here. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this down to this track, go into it, and just remove those kicks and snares. So you've got just the hats. And likewise over here, I'm going to remove the hats. So now we have separated the two. I'm going to label this part hats so I know what the difference is. I want this to go to the Groove agent instrument, and this is going to be on MIDI channel 1. So just playing it back to make sure that they're both working. Yeah, that's working. Then on the drums, I'm going to bypass or remove this MIDI modifier. And then on the hats over here, I'm going to add the MIDI modifier to this instrument track. So I'll go to the MIDI inserts, add the MIDI modifier over here. And over here, I can randomize that velocity. So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to set it to -30 and the max to 30 as well. So now the kick and snare are going to stay exactly the same as I had them. The hats are going to be more randomized with regards to the velocity. And you can tweak them while it goes. I find that that minimum is a bit too low, so I'm going to set that to about -15. And I'm liking that. Now, how about also shifting the note position or randomizing the position so you get more of a bit of a swing on the notes? So for this, let's change this to -30 and leave the maximum at 0. Now, if we had to change this to 30, you'd see that it would swing quite a bit. Now, that's feeling a bit off because I want them to be a bit late, but not a bit too pushed on the maximum. So let's try maybe -40. And let's maybe try the velocity again at -30. That's working, but maybe -20 will be the ideal position. And for this, going back to -30. So just doing slight tweaking to get that sound that we're after. So this was before. Very straight. And now with some randomization and position switching. Okay, so I'm happy with that. So this hasn't changed what the MIDI note data looks like, But what if I actually want the MIDI note data to represent what I hear? Well, then I need to freeze the MIDI modifiers. And to do that, I need to go to the MIDI menu and then down to freeze MIDI modifiers. Now, just keep an eye on the hats when I do this. You see how those notes have been altered. So I've lost a bit of a note because it's pushed forward. So just to fix that, let's go back. I want to undo the change and drag this out. So I've got a bit of a beginning section, then I can go back to MIDI and freeze MIDI modifiers. And there we go. It has pushed everything around and changed the velocities and as well the note position. If I zoom in closer, you'll see exactly what I mean. So see how some of these notes have been pushed a bit early. And these have been pushed different amounts between 0 and -30, as you can see by taking a look over here and here. And I feel that this definitely adds to the performance and makes it feel more like a real drummer. Now let's go down to this synth lead part over here. And I'm just playing a constant note. So I'm just going to take those off and solo it. So it's the same pitch. And the same way that you used the MIDI modifier to add some randomization to the velocities and the note positions, how about randomizing the pitch? So I'm going to go over here, change this to pitch, and I want it to go down -5 and up 7. Now we can play back and take a listen at how this randomized pitch is sounding on this instrument. Now in solo that, we can make it more drastic, maybe -12 and 12 up here. So what I'm trying to show you is that you can take something that's quite simple. So for example, the synth was this before, and then with some randomization. And I can freeze the randomized pitch data by going back to the freeze MIDI modifiers, and that jumps those notes around, and then I can go in and tweak those settings. So really quite a flexible solution to help you get some ideas for parts that might sound a bit static and stagnant. You can use these MIDI modifiers to really spice things up. So just to sort of show you what we've learned here, let me show you in a full production how I'd like to use this. So for example, here, I've got this synthwave outrun type of piece. So you get the idea. Now let's use what I just showed you previously and apply it to this track. So I'm going to go to the hats. With this, I'm going to add a MIDI modifier and just modify or randomize the velocities on the notes. So we've got the hats over here. Randomize velocity, set the minimum and maximum range. And shift or randomize the position. So we've got that. Let's do it slightly. Let's do it by -10 and 10. Then let's go for something else. So I just want to just drag these beginnings to there so we can get a bit of a jump in the part if we need to. These pianos, pads, they've got the exact same start position. So how about randomizing them as well? So we'll go to the modifiers, we'll go to randomize the position, and this is going to be really slight. I just want -10 to 10. So it's just randomizing them slightly, and the same for these pads. Going to go to the MIDI modifier, add in randomize position, also just shift them slightly. And even though I've set the same maximum and minimum position for the pads, if I go to the piano, it's going to do the same, but randomize it. So they're not always going to be starting at the same position. So these are right on the grid, the same with that. But now if I'm playing back and I've got that randomization, it's just going to give a bit more of a human feel to it where you're not hitting those notes exactly always on the grid. And maybe for the bass as well, that's hard quantize there. So what I'm going to do is add some MIDI modifier to change the velocities very ever so slightly, and also the position. So starting for the position, -10, maybe do this to 15. So you just tweak them as you go, and then randomize the velocities as well by -15 and 15. Now, if I go freeze those MIDI modifiers, so I'll freeze that. We got the hats as well, and then the pads. I could assign this to a keyboard command so that I can do it a lot quicker, but for now, I'm just showing you exactly where it is in the menus. So if I just take a look at these hats, I've changed the velocities. Some things are slightly off the grid. The same with the bass. If I just had to zoom in here, ever so slightly, those things are off the grid. So with those pianos, if I just take a look at them, they've been shifted ever so slightly as well. So I just want that variance that's going to give a bit more of a human feel. And I really find by using these modifiers and then freezing them down to a MIDI part, I can later go in and just take a look and see that things have been slightly shifted off. But overall, it does add to the performance and give some humanization to it. Now, there's also an inline MIDI editor, and this is really handy because normally when you're editing your MIDI, you're going to double click on this and it's going to open up the key editor in the lower pane. You can click here to expand it to a full screen view or drop it back down to the lower pane, or you can go to the MIDI menu and open up the key editor over here. But all these involve opening up other views to see the MIDI editor. Now, with the inline editor, what you do is you just make sure you've got a track selected. I've got the strings track over here. And then if I hit Command Shift and I or Control Shift and I, it opens up an inline key editor right here on the track. And this is really nice if you just want to quickly open up. For example, I'm just going to close that again using the same shortcut key. Now, let's say with these strings, I just want to extend those notes. Instead of double clicking here to open it up in the lower pane view and then going to make the changes, instead, I can just use that shortcut for the inline editor. So Control or Command Shift I can go there, I can select those notes, quickly extend them, hit that same shortcut key again, and I'm back to this range area here where I just see the event. So it's a really quick and easy way to get to your MIDI and edit it. So let's do the same thing with the drums. Let's say I go into these drums and I want to go into the inline editor and I want to select all these kicks and delete them. So I can hover over here on C1 and then hold down Command and click that. It's going to select all those notes. I hit delete and I've deleted all the kicks from my drums track over here. And then I can hide the inline editor again and then continue with my editing. And also, it's safe to assume if I go back there again, if I just click over here, I can get to all those same tools that I want to use in the MIDI editor to edit my MIDI. So that's just a very quick overview of how to use inline editor. It can be really helpful if you don't want to open up other windows to go into to edit the MIDI. You can just quickly open it up over here and go in and make changes. For example, maybe I want to change some of the velocities. I can just quickly change them like that, close that editor, and there we are back in the range area. Now, I'd say the only negative about it is if you open it up, it is quite small, so it's hard to see your MIDI note data. But if you really need to go in and get finer detail, that's probably where you'll want to go into the key editor and edit the data there and zoom up and see those notes a lot closer and do the editing that you need to do. And then you can close that back down again. Now, another way of viewing the inline editor, maybe you forgot the shortcut key, is to set up a button in the track control settings here. So you can just click that and you can view it. So by default, I haven't got anything here. What I need to do is right click here and go to the track control settings, then click on instrument and then choose edit in place and add it to the visible controls over here. So I'll click apply and you can see that I've got this button there now. And if I click OK, all I have to do is click this and I can view the inline editor and then click it again to remove it. Another thing to point out is also, let's say you've got some MIDI notes that are up here that are out of view. Then what you can do is just go over here on that piano roll and just scroll up or down to move that into view. And it does bring me to another point on why the inline editor is so handy. And that's that everything is going to be in view. So if you, for example, if I get rid of this inline editor and I click on this, you've got different zooming settings that are set up in the key editor compared to the project window here with the arrangement. So as you can see, let's say I want to go to bar 10 over here and I want to edit this kick over here. When I open up that low pane, I need to sort of scroll to where it is. And here is bar 10 and my bar 10 is here. So it's not in view. And obviously the beauty of the inline editor is if I go to bar 10 and I view the inline editor, I'm going to be right there in view and I can see where everything is in my arrangement. Maybe, for example, I want to navigate to this point over here so that I can check that my kick is completely in line with my bass head over here. So that's where this inline editor really comes into play. So in the last video, you saw CC1, which is control change message number 1 that deals with modulation. Now, in this video, let's take a look at expression, which is CC11. Now, the best way to think of expression is to think of it as controlling the amplitude. So it's not the volume, but it's the amplitude of the MIDI note data. And this works really well when using it in conjunction with CC1. So for example, on these strings over here, I'm just going to lay down a D. And as I move my modulation wheel down, I've got a lower level. Now I'm going to record in a part and I'm going to show you how you can use expression with modulation. So I'm just going to turn on my click and record. And I'm going to record in the modulation while I play in the notes. So that's just at a low modulation. Okay, so I'll turn off the click. Now, if I double click this, you can see I've got some modulation here and it's using CC1. Now I'm just going to add another lane and I'm going to add expression. So over here, I can draw in some expression. I'm going to go for my draw tool and I'm just going to draw in one note there. So if I just play this back over here, I've got a low modulation with a low expression. Now, I want that low dynamic, but I want to have a lighter amplitude. So I can take this and increase this up. Now watch this out. So the amplitude is louder and the dynamics are increasing. Now, what happens with orchestral samples like this with strings is it switches between different samples as it increases with modulation. So maybe let's just draw in a line over here. So I'm going to draw in quite a heavy modulation and we're going to play back. And if I just drop this down again, I'm going to have a low expression. So it's a low amplitude. So what a great way to do is to work in conjunction with CC1 and CC11. So you've got low dynamics over here and you want to increase the amplitude and maybe you want to decrease it as it gets louder. I could draw in a higher expression, then decrease it and do things like this so the two are working together. So I've got a higher amplitude for the low dynamics and then the amplitude decreases as the modulation or the dynamics increases. So let's just jump over here and take a listen. So what you're getting is a nice even level by using the expression to control the amplitude as it changes by different modulation or dynamic levels with CC1. Another thing I'd like to point out, if you take a look at these notes over here, I've got these notes which are quite short, and then there's this other extra little detail over here. And this has to do with the expression data. So this is note expression. If I take this off, then you're not going to see that expression. So if I click that, you've got the note expression. And the reason that this note is short is because I also used a sustain pedal. So I held the sustain pedal over there and it's holding out that note. So I just wanted to point that out. So I'm just going to remove that lane. So I've just got those 3 lanes. So if you're seeing something like this where you're seeing all that data, that's just because you're showing the note expression data. Now, I'm going to get to note expression a bit later in this video series, but just for now, if you see those things or you see it in your productions when using it, just note that that's probably this armed. So just turn that off and then you're going to see your notes. So that's using an orchestral instrument that uses dynamics. Now, let's take a look if I'm using, for example, this pad shop that's using different type of modulation or CC1. So for example, with this, if I play here, that's changing the filter and the grains on the pad shop. So I'm going to mute the strings and just play in a part as well. So that's that part, and you can hear as the grains change. So let's go in there, and then let's add some expression. So I'm going to add another lane, go for expression, which is CC11, and then from there, I can draw in different notes. So here is my modulation. I'm going to start off with the line tool, and I'm going to have a low amplitude, bring it up halfway, then bring it down, then do the same thing, just have some sort of differing patterns. So you can see how we can work between multiple CC messages and get different results by working with modulation and expression and amplitude. So the best way to think about it is if the modulation parameter that you're editing, if you feel like it's adding too much level or amplitude as you increase it up, maybe use the expression lane to pull things up or pull things down to adjust how that modulation is changing the amplitude. And as you can see, you can work between multiple CC lanes and create a more dynamic and expressive performance. In this video, I want to show you how you can use the MIDI sends. And with the MIDI sends, you can take a MIDI part with the included CC data and send it to other instruments. And this comes in really handy if you've got a part that you're really happy with. You don't want to change anything and you want to send it to the instruments. But then if you want to make changes later, one change to this part will be sent to all the instruments. So let me show you how this is done. Starting off, I've got this pads track here with an instance of Retrolog, and it sounds like this. So as you can see, if I go over here, I've got some notes with some modulation that's written in. It's changing the dynamics. Now to use MIDI sends, you first need a MIDI track. I've got instrument tracks here. I've got a pad, I've got a piano, I've got pad shop, and then I've got this instrument over here with Hellion on that's giving a bell sound. But I want to create a MIDI track that's going to send this MIDI note data to these 4 instruments. So let's go to Project, Add Track, and add a MIDI track. I'm just going to call it chords because it's going to be these chords in a MIDI event. I'll click Add. Now I just want to grab this track, drag it to the top, and then I want to take this MIDI event and drag it onto these chords. Then I need to set the MIDI channel. So this is just going to be MIDI channel 1, and I don't want it going to this instrument. So if I just go over here, I can choose for it to not go anywhere. So it's not connected. It's not going anywhere. If I play back, we're not going to have anything because this is just data, but we need to send the MIDI data to an instrument. So now I can go down to the MIDI sends tab over here. If you're not seeing it, just click over here on this gear icon and make sure that that's ticked. Then on here, I can enable the send and choose what's connected to. So first, let's connect this to the Retrolog instrument. Now when I play back, I'm getting that signal. And I can send it to other tracks as well. So here I've got a piano. So I can go back to this chord track, enable this send, and connect that to the piano. So that is now sending this MIDI part to the pads and to the piano. And I can go to each instrument and make changes. Maybe I want to go to the piano, then down to the piano over here to the audio fader and increase the level. Now let's send it to the other tracks. So over here, I'll connect this. I want this to go to Pad Shop. Do a quick playback to test it's working. And as you can hear, it's sending that modulation data to that instrument. For example, if I were to go in here and select all the modulation and just compress it down and maybe drop the level, there'll be less modulation that's happening to this pad shop because the MIDI note data is being sent to all the instruments. But I quite like the effect on the pad, so I'm just going to undo those changes and rather go into Pad Shop and just drop that fader level. And then pad to the side. And lastly, I just want to go back here and send it to one more instrument, which is going to be the bell melody. So that is an instance of Hellion. Going to the instrument and changing that fade level. So all of that from one MIDI event. So one MIDI event with some modulation is being sent to 4 other instruments. Now you can even take it a step further by creating extra events. And on those events, you can do other CC changes that are going to pertain only to those instruments, but still the other data is going to be sent. So for example, let's say with the pads, on this, I want to edit some of the expression. So I'll go in here. For this lane, let's choose expression, which is CC11, and I can draw some data in. Maybe going on to this piano, I want to do a MIDI volume change. So that's volume. I'll go for the line tool, and we're going to just slowly increase the volume of that piano throughout the duration. Then for Pad Shop, we'll also do some expression that's a bit lower. And the bells can be the same. So what we've got here is this MIDI data event sending the chords to these 4 instruments, plus sending the CC1 data information to these instruments. But then on these instruments, I've got extra CC data that pertains just to those instruments. And you get something like this. So very powerful stuff there. So you've got one MIDI event here with some note data and CC data sending to 4 different instruments via the MIDI sends. Now in this video, I want to talk about the drum editor window and how it's a really helpful tool if you're programming in your drums. So over here, I've got the key editor open and I've got some drums that I've programmed in, and they sound like this. So that's using Steven Slate drums, and I've just programmed in this part. And there's some things that I really just think that the key editor doesn't do justice to drums where the drum editor does. So for example, you've got your MIDI notes. So this is C1, that's D1. You probably know that C1 is the kick, D1 is the snare. This is mapped to your sort of general MIDI standards for drums. But for example, if you're going over here or just having a quick look, you might see these and think, yeah, maybe those are cymbals, but is it a ride? Is it a crash? Where my toms may be over here. So you don't really get a very good idea of which hit is your drum hit. Now that is where the drum edits window comes in handy. So if I go to the MIDI option over here and open up the drum editor, this gives you a much better idea of your drums. So at the moment, this is just using the general MIDI drum map standard. So we've got your kick or bass drum on C1, you've got a side stick on C sharp 1, and then your snare on D1, just going through all these hits over here. And what I like about this is it doesn't take note length into consideration, because with your drums, you don't really need to know about note length. You've just got that initial transient hits of the drums. For example, if I just close this down here, you can see that some of my snares and kicks have shorter and longer times, or you might even have a hit like this that goes into other. Well, it doesn't really matter when it comes to drums. That's really the key thing when it comes to drums and programming them in. All you need to know is where the drum hit is. So here's a kick, there's a snare, and so on. And because you've got this lane here showing you which each instrument is, you can very quickly and easily program in your drums. For example, over here, I've got an open hat. When let's say I just want to change this to a closed hat, I can just grab this and change it to the closed hat section. Or maybe I want to take these as well. So I can just move them up. So I've just got very quick, easy access to build up my drums. Or let's say I want to bring those back down to the open hats and I want to add a tom hit over here. So I can just grab a hit. I'm just going to hold down Optional Alt to duplicate it. And I've got that hit over there. And also if I hold down Shift and Command or Shift and Control, I can change the velocity hit of it. So basically what I just want to show you here is if you haven't used the drum editor, really get into it for your drum editing and programming. You can see each hit, you can see the naming convention, especially if they're using a general drum MIDI standard. You've already got this all set up and you can very quickly and easily get in there and change your drums. Now, what if your drum instrument that you're using is mapped to a different scenario where the pitches aren't the same as the general MIDI standard? Well, that's where in the next video, I'm going to show you how you can build up your own drum maps and use them for your productions. In this video, let's talk about MIDI Aftertouch and how we can use it in our MIDI productions. So what is Aftertouch? So in this video, I'm going to be using my Atom PreSonus device because this supports Aftertouch. So first off is to make sure that the MIDI controller that you're using supports Aftertouch. Now, what is Aftertouch? So when you press a key, it's going to send MIDI note data. Then when you add pressure, it's going to send aftertouch data. And with this aftertouch data, you can use it to manipulate and modify and edit a parameter on an instrument. For example, maybe when you add pressure on the note, it's going to open up a cutoff filter or add some extra vibrato on an instrument. So let's take a look at this in action. So I'm using an instance of PadShop. It's got this preset over here, the Jetstream. And down in the modifier matrix section over here, I'm using the aftertouch modifier, and the source is going to be the filter envelope, and the destination is going to be the cutoff. So basically, when I add pressure with the aftertouch, it's going to open up the filter by increasing the cutoff. So I'm going to close this instrument, and I'm just going to record a part, and we can see it in action. So take a watch over here. So I'm just going to softly hit a pad, and then I'm going to add pressure to another pad, and then add some pressure again. So if I stop my recording now, you can see there's the MIDI note data and then the aftertouch MIDI note data. And if I double click and go into the key editor, here you can see the MIDI notes, and then down here, you can view the aftertouch lane. So if you're not seeing that, you can just go down to the plus sign here and choose to see the aftertouch. And as you can see, this was quite drastic, but what you heard was I was laying a sustained note, and with the aftertouch or the extra pressure added, it creates some extra interest by opening up that filter. So I could always go in here and soften some of those, or maybe go back and do a recording and add a bit less pressure. But I think you get the idea. As you can hear and see, it's a good way to add some extra expression and dynamics into your MIDI performance. Now, if I just go back to this instrument, you can also see that I've increased the amount of aftertouch. So for example, if I drop this down, it's not going to apply as much aftertouch pressure to open up that cutoff. I'm pressing really hard there, and it's not doing nearly as much. But if I open that up, that applies a bigger aftertouch pressure, setting more MIDI note data to open up that cutoff filter. So basically, you can choose how much of the aftertouch is being sent to the instrument. And I'll show you this with another instrument. So let's just go down over here. This is an instance of the old version of Massive, which I'm a big fan of. And I've got this preset All Souls, and I just got to open up that cutoff. So I've enabled a parameter over there to open up the cutoff. So this is what it sounds like. But instead of using a parameter to open this up, I want to use aftertouch. So I'm going to pull this down, and then down over here, I've got this AT, which stands for aftertouch, and I can use that as a modifier to apply aftertouch, and I can choose how much of that I want to apply. So now if I record something in, it's opening up that filter. So you can see what's happening there. As I'm applying pressure, it's creating that sort of pulsing sound or vibrato sound. So you can really get some interesting results, especially like that, where you're using the pressure to give some extra emphasis to some notes or create something like vibrato or a pulsing effect. So that's how to use aftertouch in your productions. And you can always go into the vents after you've recorded it in and go in and fine tune the aftertouch data that's been sent to the instrument. Now we've taken a look at quantizing very simply in a few videos. And basically what I've shown you is that you can select some pieces in your MIDI clip, and then you hit Q, and that quantizes it to the grid, determined on what you've got set up over here. So for example, I've set my quantize value to 8th notes, and it's pulled in all the notes to the closest, nearest 8th note for that respective note. Now I'm just going to undo those changes. And now I want to explore the quantize panel and how we can use this to really get some great results from our quantization of our MIDI. And this can be anything from taking a piece and hard quantizing it onto the grid, or by using other things like catch ranges to minimize how hard it's quantized, or even using MIDI clips to impart a groove onto the MIDI clip. But first off, let's take a listen to this MIDI part over here. It's just something I've done with some drums, just a simple rock beat. But what you'll notice is the thing is slightly out of time, and that's because I recorded it in with my MIDI controller and my timing wasn't perfect. So for example, if I just zoom up on here, you'll see how things aren't lining up exactly on the grid. Now let's take a listen. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit, get that into view, and play back. So as you heard there, I'm sure you can hear that there's some slight timing issues with this MIDI performance. So I want to show you what we can do with the quantize panel. So I'm going to go to edit and then down here to quantize panel. So that brings up the quantize panel that just gives us some more advanced settings on what we can do with our MIDI. Let's say we want to hard quantize it. So I'm going to set the grid value. I'm going to do the same. I've got it set to 8th notes. I don't want to add any swing or catch range for now. And I'm just going to quantize it. And as you see, it hard quantizes all those notes to the nearest 8th note. Now that's great, but sometimes hard quantizing things can lose a bit of the feel and the groove. So I'm going to undo those changes. And now instead, I'm going to add a slight bit of the catch range. So what this does if I put the catch range all the way up to 100%, that means it's going to take all the notes and move it to the nearest eighth note. But if I reduce this catch range, what that means is it's going to take notes that are nearest to the grid, move them over, but the ones that are further away, it's not going to hard quantize these. So I've got this set at about 23%, and let's quantize. So as you see, that moved everything near onto the grid. But if I undo that and drop this catch range to maybe like 6% and quantize, there's less move. So let me show you that again. I'm going to go maybe up to something higher, like 48%, quantize, does it all hard on the grid. Undo it, and let's pull it down to about 15% and quantize. Everything is still on the grid there, but as you can see, some things were slightly off because the timing wasn't so great on those. But if I pull this down to maybe about 10%, what we've got here is a MIDI performance that is improved, but still some notes are slightly out. But that still doesn't sound quite right. What I'm wanting to do is get the timing better, but still have a feel and groove to the piece. So let's try this. Let's take the catch range, turn that off. So I don't want any catch range. I'm going to quantize to eighth notes, but I want to add in a bit of swing. So that swing is going to give a bit more groove to the piece. So let's take the swing and make it around about 40%. And taking a look here, you can see how things are being shifted off, and as well as the grid lines over here, I can take this and it's going to give a swing value to it. Yeah, that works quite nice. I'd say the swing value is a bit high. What we could do is undo that and instead do maybe a swing value of about 20% and listen to it. And maybe one more with a bit less swing at about 10%. So adding in a bit of swing can sometimes take a very straight feeling groove and give it a bit more life with a bit of groove. Now, let me show you some other ways that you can sort of implement groove onto a piece. So I'm going to leave everything hard quantized, but what I've got here are two MIDI clips, and with these MIDI clips, they've got their own sort of groove pattern. If I had to, let's say, zoom up, you can see that some things don't fall quite on the grid. If I had to go to 16th notes, you can see there how some things are drifted off. And basically, with notes with different amounts that are veering off the grid, these type of things give a clip or MIDI performance its type of groove. In a lot of old school electronic machines back in the days in the 80s and 90s, you had these electronic drum machines that had types of groove patterns built into them, and you could program in a drum beat and then apply a groove to it to give it a bit more feel and a bit more life. So let's try something out. I've got two different groove patterns here, one of them with a bit more of a groove than the other, and I'm going to show you how you can take these grooves, pull them into the quantize panel, and then apply them to another MIDI event. So it's pretty easy. You just need to take the MIDI clip, drag it here onto the quantize settings, and there we go. That has picked up this rock groove. So it's slightly different here. You've got your position where you can decide if you want the position to sit 100% onto how this groove pattern is. You can set up velocity mounts and even change how the length is quantized to the groove. I'm going to leave these set at these parameters, then select this MIDI event, just keep a note over here, and then hit quantize. Now that's given this MIDI performance a different groove. Quite a bit different. Maybe try another groove. So I'm going to undo that and take this groove pattern over here and drag it on. We've got a different groove. Select this MIDI event and quantize. And now hear how drastic this one is. So retrospectively, let me go back to what we had before. This was the straight groove. And now with this groove pattern. So basically what I'm showing you here is you don't always have to think of quantize as a way to hard quantize your performance onto the grid so it's nice and tight. You can do that, it works for some songs, but sometimes you want to give a piece a bit more of a feel and a bit more of a groove. And that's where you can implement things like swing or pull in MIDI clips that you've got that have got their own built-in groove, pull it into the quantize panel and apply that to a different MIDI clip to give its own feel taken from another performance. In this video, let's talk about key changing and articulation switching. Now, when I mean key changing, what I mean is you hit a key and that key triggers a change in articulation. For example, maybe you've got a string patch that's playing some sustained chords, then you hit another key that's out of the range of the notes that are being played back by the instrument, but it triggers the articulation to change to maybe a staccato piece. So that's what I mean by key changing. I don't mean key changing by changing the pitch or key of the note data. It's referring to an instrument that supports key chaining. For example, I'm using East-West's Symphonic Orchestra over here. Here is the range of notes that play this 16 violin patch. And over here are the key switching patches to switch between all the different types of articulations. So I'm going to play back this little MIDI event over here, and then we'll talk more about key changing. Take a listen here. So what you heard there was a string section that started off with some sustained notes, then went to some short staccato notes, then to some pizzicato, and then finally ending off with some trem strings. And maybe what you didn't notice is if I scroll down here, here are the key changing MIDI notes. So they're out of the range. And also another thing to point out is that they play before the note. So at bar 3 is where I start the strings, but the key change happens before. And if you look at this MIDI event over here, you'll maybe see it now more clearly. Here are the notes, here is some modulation, and then here are the MIDI notes that are outside of the range. So that is the really cool thing about key changing. And if your instrument supports it, you can input note data out of the range to switch the articulation to add more interest to your piece. So as you could hear, we went from different articulations and it just was some sort of ear candy for the ear so you could hear that change. Now let's talk about the sort of not so great things about key changing. What you heard me sort of mention was that the key change MIDI note trigger needs to happen before the note. So if I play back here, it hits that note or detects that note as the key change, and then it goes into that particular articulation. Then down over here, this is the switch to the staccato notes. So for example, let me go over that pickup note for the key change in a bit more detail. So at bar 3 here, we got these sustained chords, but the key change is just before. So I'm going to play before, so it picks up that note, and I'm going to play into the sustained notes, and then I just want to show you something. So take a look here. So there's the sustained notes. Now they're the staccato notes, and that's changed because it picks up the notes over here. Now, if I just jump to bar 3, so I'm after that note pickup and play back, it's playing these sustained notes, staccato. So that's one of the big sort of maybe things you just got to make sure that you're doing with articulation and key switching. You need to make sure that you're setting your playhead just before so that it picks up that articulation change so you get the correct dynamic and articulation playing back. And another thing that also sort of is not so great is if you had to select all your notes and you wanted to jump them up 2 semitones. So I've gone from C to D. Now if I play back, watch what happens when I get over here. So the articulation notes are pitched up as well. And instead of going for staccato over there, it's gone to pizzicato. So to sort of prevent this from happening, there's 2 things you could do. So one, you can not select these notes. So just go up here and select just these notes and jump them up 2 semitones, and that retains your articulations that you set up over there. Now that's okay. As you can see, it can be a bit tedious because you have to select the right notes and everything. But another thing I want to show you is if your instrument supports program change, then you can use that instead. So let me show you how that's done. So on this instrument, on East-West, it does support program change, other libraries and instruments support as well. So I'm going to get rid of these articulation key switching notes over here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to my instrument. And there's a setting in there that I need to change. So if I go to the preferences over here, then into the MIDI tab, I've got this option for articulations for program change to articulations. And that basically means if I use a program change message, it'll switch the articulation. Now, program change can be found in your bottom lane over here, much like you can find your velocity, modulation, and CC data. So over here, I've got velocity. I can see my note velocity. But if I click over here, I can choose to show program change. And then what I can do is input a note. So I'm just going to go to my draw tool and just draw in a note there. And what I can do is move this around. So I'm going to move it to, let's say, 1. And what 1 is going to be the first articulation. So if I play back, you can hear that that is sustained. And if I jump it up somewhere else, maybe to, let's say, 10, you can hear that's doing a different articulation. Jump it up to 17. It's a short note. Let's maybe jump it down somewhere else, maybe about 8. So it's got your crescendo notes. So that's perfectly fine. That's a good way to work. So if I wanted my sustain, I could go here. Then let's say I want to do a different articulation at bar 7. I can create another note there. It can be just before. Let's jump it up to, let's say, 17 and just take a listen. So we're going to start off with sustain. And now the change. Let's maybe create one more point. So I'm going to create another point down here and just move that down to, let's say, 4. So I'm going to jump back. So the important thing to know is just to know what program change number changes to which articulation. But the benefit of this over key changing is that you don't need the note data that is outside of the range to switch the articulation. Then you can go and select all your notes and shift them up, and it's going to retain the articulation change. Also, the nice thing is you can see visually over here in the program change where there's changes with articulation. So that's 2 ways for changing articulations in Cubase. You've got key changing and then program change if your instrument supports it. Now, in the next video, let me show you one more other way, which is personally my favorite, and that's using expression maps and creating expression maps to switch between your different articulations. Now, a multi-timbral instrument is an instrument that can load up more than one instrument at a time. And in this video, I'm going to show you how you can do it with Hellion. So with Hellion, you can see here, you've got 16 slots where you can load up 16 different instruments. Then these will be mapped to specific MIDI channels. And I'll also show you how you can create separate outputs for these so you have full control of each instrument. Now, why would you want to go with a multi-timbral instrument instead of just creating separate instrument tracks. Now, you might have an instrument that's multi-timbral, but when you load it up as individual instrument tracks, there's quite a lot of CPU load. So you might want to use a multi-timbral one, and then you've got the ability to use MIDI tracks to target those instruments within the multi-timbral instrument. So with Hellion over here, I've loaded up one instrument in the one slots over here. When I play it back, it's just a solo violin, and it goes like this. Now let's say I want to load up another instrument. So over here in the second slot, I want to load up a strings patch. It's going to be a viola this time, and we're going to go for this viola patch over here. So watch now. I've got this instrument that's playing back, but not the second one. And that's because this is on a different MIDI channel and needs a MIDI track that is routed to that MIDI channel. So let me show you what we need to do. So I'm going to create a MIDI track. With this MIDI track, I'm just going to call it viola. And as you can see, it's created this on MIDI channel 2, and this is going to MIDI channel 1. So I can copy this MIDI clip across, and now it's playing both instruments. So I'm going to load up some other strings here. So we've got a full orchestra. So for here, I'm going to go for strings. I'm going to go for cello. And we're going to add this general MIDI cello bit over here. And then for here, let's go for some bass. So we get this contrabass over here. So basically, we've got 4 different instruments. And we need 2 extra MIDI channels to map to those instruments. So I can just double click here. It creates a new MIDI track that's assigned to that MIDI channel. And likewise, if I click again, it's going to create the MIDI track that's going to channel 4. And this is going to be cellos. And then this is going to be bass. So I can copy this part down. Let's say the cellos are going to be a whole octave lower. So I'm going to select them all and just hit shift and down. And it's going to shift down an octave. And likewise, the basses, I'm going to select those as well and shift them down an octave. And then maybe with the violins, I'm going to shift them up an octave. And let's just label this accordingly. So that'll be violins, then we've got viola, cellos, and then bass. Now when I play back, it's triggering all those instruments within Hellion. And just to neaten things up, let's just relabel these MIDI events. So this is violins. This is violas. This is cellos. And then this is basses. So there we go. Everything is nice and neat. Now the problem I'm having now is if I go across to my mix console, I've only got one output, which is this violin output, and I can't tweak any of the other outputs. So for example, if I wanted to go to this violas and cellos and bass here, these are actually MIDI tracks. So this is MIDI volume and MIDI pan, and they're currently set off. So I could tweak these to change the volume of each one and maybe change the panning, but that's as much control as I have. So just to show you, if I had to increase this violas over here, watch here as the volume is changing. So these are the only changes I can do on each instrument. If I've got it all the way to the bottom, it's off, and then panning as well, I can change the panning. So I could go back in here and adjust the volume as needed and adjust the panning. But let's say I want more control of these instruments. I want dedicated outputs for them so that I can add mixing and processing within Cubase within my mix console. Well, to do that, you need to create multi-outputs for this instrument. So if I just close this here and close this here, if I go over onto my instrument, I go over here, and this is going to activate the other outputs. So as you can see here, I can select different outputs for this device, but I first need to assign them in Hellion. So if I go over to this, I can go to the violas. It's currently going to the main output, but I want it to go to output 2. So the violins is main, which is output 1. Violas is output 2. Cellos is going to be output 3. And then contrabass is going to be output 4. Now, if I go to the active outputs over here, these have already been set up because I activated them in Hellion, and Hellion has a very close relationship with Cubase. Now, if you're using a third-party instrument like Contact, you're going to have to make sure that you set up the correct outputs on that. So just make sure that you know how to set the outputs or the extra multi-outputs on your instrument but using in Cubase. Another way to activate the outputs is if you go to the right pane over here and you've got your instrument, you can click over here and activate the outputs over there. So you click there and it's got the same slots or outputs that you can select. Okay, so now that we've set up the outputs, watch this. As I go to my console over here, you can see we've got the different outputs. Now I can rename each one. So this is going to be violas, this is cellos, and this is bass. So now I can mix them, change the panning, maybe the violins to the left, violins to the right. This isn't correct orchestral panning. I'm just doing it for demonstration purposes. Cellos to the right and basses to the left. And then obviously we could go into each channel editor and do some settings by adding inserts or doing some effects that we want to create on each track. Now, just another thing I just want to talk about, it can get quite confusing if you click on this track over here and you click on this to edit the channel settings. That's actually going to go to the output for the violins. So an extra step that'll really help you is to go to each MIDI track and choose the output. So this is actually the violas. So I can click over here and go to output and choose the output for violas. The same for the cellos. We're going to choose the output for cellos, and the basses, we're going to have the basses. So that just means when you select a MIDI track and you go to edit the channel settings, it's going to the correct output for that MIDI track, which is assigned to the multi-timbral instrument. Then one more thing just to neaten everything up. If you go back to your mix console, you've got your outputs for all the different instruments. Then you've also got these extra MIDI tracks, which you don't really need to see. So what you can do, you can just click over here to get this little top panel and click over here and choose to hide the MIDI channels in the mix console. So now things are way neater. In our range area, we got the MIDI events, we've got the tracks. If you click on each track, it'll go to the respective channel editor settings. And then if you go to the mix console, you've got your outputs for the respective instruments. So that is how to use multi-timbral instruments in Cubase and how to create multiple outputs for the respective instruments within the multi-timbral instrument track. So in the previous videos, I showed you how you could do articulation switching using key change notes. So these are notes that are outside of the range that you have to trigger to change the articulation. And then also I showed you how you could use program change to switch between articulations. Now in this video, I want to show you my preferred method, which is using expression maps. And the reason that I like this is that it's tied to the note. You don't have to pick up a note before or pick up a change before to do the articulation change. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to be using a different instrument. Over here, I've got an instance of Strummed Acoustic 2 by Native Instruments. It has some nice strummed acoustic patterns. These are the articulation changes over here. So it's just some different strum patterns and then some crescendos and a crescendo muted. And down over here, you can see I'm playing these notes, and these are the key changing notes that trigger the different articulation changes. And it sounds like this. So you can see here how it's switching those articulations, and watch as each note triggers a different clip over here. It'll go back. So that is your typical key changing using note data outside of the range. Now let's take a look at how to set up an expression map. So to do that, you just need to double click your MIDI event, and then on the inspector over here, you've got this option expression maps. Then you click expression map to go to the setup. Now over here, I can create an expression map for that instrument. I can click plus sign here and give this expression map a name. So this is just Strummed Acoustic 2. Then over here, you're going to have all your different types of articulations. They're going to be assigned to a note, and then you can choose the output mapping and then the articulation type. So just to be more clear, I just want to open up that instrument. And as you can see, the first one is at C1. So I'm going to create my first slot over here. So that is C1. I can give that a name. Let's just give it the name of the strum pattern, which is handmade A. And then over here, I can choose the output mapping. So this can either be a notes on message, a program change, or a controller message. This is a note change. So it's going to use a note change to switch the articulation. And that note is C1, and it's going to output a data amount of 120. So that means whenever C1 is played, it's going to switch to the handmade A articulation using a notes on message. Now let's go through the rest. So this one here is going to be C#1, and this is handmade B. See, as you click through each one, you can choose the notes on message. That's going to be notes on for C#1. Next, it's going to be D1, and D1 is handmade C. Give it a notes on message. Then we got D#1. That's handmade D. Notes on message. Then E1 is the crescendo. So I can give that name crescendo A. Notes on message. And then finally, our last articulation is F1, and that's crescendo B muted. So crescendo B muted, and give it its notes on message. Then the last thing we need to do is give each articulation an articulation type. So I'm going to click over here, and from this, you've got some different subcategories. You've got techniques, lengths, ornaments, dynamics, and as you can see, a lot of these relate to a lot of orchestral instruments. For example, if I had a pizzicato violin, I could use this as the technique. But for this, I'm using strummed acoustic, so it needs its own custom articulation. So I'll select custom here. Then over here, I'm going to choose direction. I'll show you in a bit why I choose direction. And then for description, I can call it whatever I want. So I'm going to call it strum A. Then over here, I'm going to give articulation as well, custom one. So you just do it for each one. Strum B, just running through these quickly. Another articulation, direction, strum D. This is going to be a crescendo. And then finally, this last guy here is crescendo B muted. So there we have created our expression map. So I can actually save this, so I can recall it at a later stage if I want. But for now, I just want to close this down and show you something. Now, the next thing to do is make sure that we're choosing that expression map. So for this MIDI event, I'm using Strummed Acoustic 2. Now what you can see is I can see each articulation type, which one's being triggered, and the name that's been given to it. So just to demonstrate this a bit more clearly, I'm just going to zoom out quickly, get rid of all these articulations here. So what we got is we got C1 going to D1 sharp and then F. So I'll just remove those. Then what I can do is go down to my lane over here. Instead of displaying velocity, I can scroll down and choose to view articulations and dynamics. And now what you're seeing is you're seeing the name of all the articulations that have been created. And the nice thing about this is that I can go in and draw in each articulation for each point at the note value. So that's going to be the first one there. So at bar 3, I can go for my pen tool. That's going to be strum A. So as I click that, that makes a strum pattern that's going across the whole duration. But now if I go to my next note, which is C3, this is actually going to be strum pattern D. As I create that, it changes the articulation at that note, so on the note point. So I can easily just go through and create these strum patterns for each note. And as you can see, it's very clear to indicate where each one is. And at bar 9, over there, I'm going to go to my crescendo muted. And I'm just going to go through and do the rest. So what I really like about expression maps is how easy it is to quickly visually see where each articulation type is. And it is locked to the note value, meaning I don't have to pick up the notes to do the articulation change. So that's back here. There we go to strum pattern D, and then finally to the crescendo. So if I just zoom out, I've got my MIDI notes over here. I've got the articulation switching that I can very clearly see, and I don't need to pick it up. So if I just play back, watch here as it switches the articulations. So that's strum pattern A. There we go. Now if I open up the instrument, you can see it's switching. And I've got the clear indication on the expression maps and the instruments. But what I really like is that the expression maps are linked to the MIDI note data within the MIDI event. So for example, over here, I've got another strummed acoustic instrument. It's using a different patch from the library, but it's got the same range for the articulation switching from C1 to F1. So for example, if I take this MIDI clip over here and I copy it across to this instrument, just making sure that that strummed instrument is using the same expression map. Then if I look in my key edits over here, switching over to the articulation and dynamics lane, it has retained the key switching that has been mapped out. As well, over here, this is a picked instrument, so it has different articulations, there's different naming, but it's using the same range. So I could do the same thing. I could just copy this down over here, make sure that that event is using the strummed acoustic expression map. It will be all linked in and switching articulations. So now, for example, I've got these two acoustic strum patterns, which are switching the strums. I've got the picked instrument that's switching the picking action, and then the bass and drums. So as you can see, that instrument is switching articulations. Jumping to the next one, same thing. And then our first instrument. So there you go. There you see the power of expression maps. This is just a very simple example using an instrument only with a few articulation switching. But you can imagine if you've got an instrument with a lot of articulations, you're going to get a lot of visual feedback from this lane over here where you can see exactly where everything's changing. So in the last video, I showed you how you could use the drum editor. And in that video, I just used the GM map standard for my drums. Now I'm using Stephen Slate drums, and most of the hits are mapped to a general MIDI standard for drums. So this is the list of the general MIDI standard. As you can see, it's quite an extensive list. But what I want to do is create a new drum MIDI map for Stephen Slate drums so that when I open up a new project and I start the drums, I can load up that map and see exactly where every hit is, because it'll have every hit where every hit is. So let me show you how that's done. First off, if I just close this and I open up my instrument. So you're just going to have to determine where the mapping is in your respective instrument. So on Stephen Slate drums over here, I've got this option here, mapping. And this has all the MIDI notes starting at the highest, G8, all the way down to C-2. And when there is a hit, you can see it over here and the name. And if I just click over here on my instrument, I can hear them playing back. So what I want to do is just start at C1. So if I just scroll up over here, I've got my kick. Actually, let's start at B0. And I'm going to show you how you can map these and save your own drum map. So let's go back to the drum editor. We've got our drums open over here. And then I'm going to go down to maps and click on drum map setup. So that brings up the general MIDI map. What I can do is create a new drum map. So I can click over here where it says functions and say new map. And I'm going to call this Slate drums, just so I know what it is. And then what I can do is go to my respective MIDI notes and then give it a name and type in all the details that I want. So for example, C1, I want to be kick. So I'm just going to label it kick. And then you can also set the snap value. So that means on the grid, it's going to show a 16th note as the grid, or I could go in and change this and make it longer. I will show you that in a second. Now, there is other details here, like you can have your in note, your out note, you can set the MIDI channel, you can determine the track output. Maybe you want the output to go to a different instrument. and you can display the name and even further things, for example, like the head symbol. So this is the symbol that will be displayed in your drum notation and how many voices the instrument's using. But I really don't need to go into too much detail on these. All I really need to do is choose the note and give the instrument a name. Now I'm just going to minimize this a bit here on the left so I can see everything and just quickly go through. So C1 is the kick, B0 is the kick double. I could call it the same exact name, so that's the kick center, but I'm gonna leave it as kick. And this goes that way, and this goes that way. So I'm just gonna progress down and give everything a name. This is the snare side stick. That's C#1. D is the snare center. I'll just call it snare for now. Snare rim shot is D#1. Now, what I'm going to do is just quickly go through the rest here, and then I'll show you how you can save it and use it. So there you go. I've input all the instruments for the respective notes. Now, I said I was going to go from B0 up to the high notes, but what I decided to do was go slightly back as well to include these other types of instrument hits over here. So now, if I go back into my drum editor, so MIDI and drum editor, so now what you got is I've got my GM map. But I could go here and click to view my slate drums. Now, this is viewing everything from C-2 all the way through to G8. And if I just scroll a bit back over here, you can see all the MIDI note data that I'd programmed in and the respective lanes. So obviously now knowing what each one is, let's say, for example, I want to take this and just down to the floor tom and move that down to the floor tom, I can do that. Or maybe I want to take it down to the splash. I can just take that over here and move it right to the splash. Now, the problem that I've got here is that I've got my MIDI note data over here. And then if I scroll up, I've got these empty sound slots over here that aren't mapped or voiced on any of these notes. And the same going down here. But I can go in and rearrange these hits so that, for example, if you just take a look at the general MIDI map, I've got my C1 starting up here, then I've got all the drum hits, and then it goes through to its unassigned sounds over here. So we can do the same thing with our own drum map. So I'm going to go back to my slate drums. We got that over there, just taking a look, and we're moving everything over here so we can see things more clearly. Then I'll go to my drum map setup, and what I can do is I can drag things up to the top. So if I go to my slate drums, you can see I've got those slots over here that are empty. What I can do is go down to C1. But actually, some of my drums start earlier. So I've got B0 and C1. So the way I like it is to have the kicks at the top. So what I can do is just select the hits and then drag it all the way to the top. So I've got my double kick first, and I'll grab the kick over here and just map these the way I want to map them. So let me just drag everything across, and then I'll show you what happens. So there you go. Now I've arranged all my hits in the order that I want, starting off with the kicks at the top, then my different variances of the snare, my toms, all the different types of hi-hat hits, then into your cymbals. So what I can do first is make sure that I save this map so that I can recall it at a later stage. I can go to functions over here, I can say save, and then I can save it in the folder that I want. I've already created a drum map folder, and I'm just going to resave over the slate drums. So there we go. I've saved my drum map. Now watch here. Now you can clearly see what actually is happening. So I've got my kicks at the top, then my snares. Maybe I could take all these snares, for example, moving over to a side stick. I've got a side stick there. Maybe take one of these, add them to a rim shot, and so on. Now, what I wanted to show you is that you can also change the snap value. So going back into the drum editor, over here, you can set different snap amounts. So maybe, for example, you want to keep all these as 16th notes, but maybe taking your crash cymbals and changing them to 8th notes, because you're going to have them on 8th notes and you're probably going to have some longer lengths to them. And maybe you just want them to be viewed differently on the grid. So I've got 8th notes over there for all my crash cymbals, and I can just save that again to make sure I save the changes. And now if I go over here, you'll see how my lanes look different for my cymbals. See that over there? I've got eighth note lanes for the crash cymbals, but everything else has got 16th note snap values for the grid. So as you can see, you can really customize the way that you want your drum map to look for the drum instrument that you're using so that you can really get in there and program your drums a lot faster. In this video, let's take a look at how we can use the arpeggiations and the MIDI inserts and some scaling to create some interest with some very simple chords and take them to another place with some extra melodies that are created with arpeggiations. So over here, I've got an instance of Retrolog and it's playing some chords and it sounds like this. So this is my Retrolog patch and these are the chords that it's playing. So it sounds quite simple, but the chords are actually playing quite complex chords. If you need to know what chords that are being played in Cubase with a MIDI event, you can just double click to select the MIDI event and just make sure that you've opened up this chord editing tab here. Then you can scroll over your notes and you can see my first chord is F major 7. Then I've got a G11 going to an A minor with an 11th, then to C sus2. Then it repeats those three chords again and ends off instead with an E minor 7 instead of the C sus2. So when you're using an arpeggiator, it helps to use it on more than 2 notes in a chord. So 3 or even 4 makes much better for your arpeggiator. So that's why I've gone for some complex chords to create some interest with the arpeggiator. So now let's add the arpeggiator. And the best way to do this is under the MIDI inserts. And you've got 2 options. You've got Apache 5, which is a simple classic arpeggiator, or you've got Apache SX, which has your classic arpeggiator plus a sequence section. For now, let's just stick with the classic section. So I want an arpeggiation pattern that's going to go up. That's going to be the direction. And then we're going to tweak some of these other settings to get it how we want it to sound. So now with the arpeggiator armed, it sounds like this. Already sounding much more interesting, but I find that arpeggiation pattern is playing too fast, so I'm going to change the step size down to 8th notes and the length 8th notes as well. So what we now got is this. Hearing it together with this piano that's playing the chords. Now it's sounding nice, but now let me show you how you can really spice it up. So I'm going to take this instrument and I'm going to duplicate the track. And on this, I'm going to change some things. So I want this to be a harmonization of this part. So what I can do is go for the MIDI modifiers. And with the MIDI modifiers, first I can set a scale so that the harmony notes are going to play in the same notes as the other parts. So looking at this part, I know that it's in F major. So I'm going to say major, and I'm going to choose F. So we're setting the scale with the MIDI modifier, meaning any notes that the arpeggiator is going to spit out is going to match up with the F major scale. Now I can transpose this up or down. Let's say we transpose it up 7. And now we got this. Now, if I didn't have that scale, so let's say for scale, we set it to no scale, listen how it's going to play some notes that are out of the scale. So that's not ideal. So it's really nice when creating harmonies or duplicating a track and changing up the transposition is to set the scale. So as I said, that's in F major. And to make some extra difference between the two, let's take this instrument over here and pan it to the one side. And then this one pans to the other side. So now we've got some separation between the two. To further change it up, because we're using the exact same instrument, so this is a duplicate of the instrument, we can go in and change some of the settings. So I'm going to increase the sustain, change the decay on the envelope, and change that cutoff. and maybe even change the waveform. And let's try some different transposition. Maybe this can go down 5, down 12 semitones, so that's a whole octave, or maybe up 4. So before we just had this, so I'm going to take off this instrument and I'm going to take off the arpeggiator. We had these chords. Add the arpeggiator. And then add in the other instruments where we have shifted up 4 semitones and locked it to a scale. So as you can see, you can have a lot of fun by just taking a simple chord progression and going to your MIDI inserts, adding some arpeggiation, setting up the parameters that you want in the arpeggiator, and then even duplicating it to another track and using a modifier to modify the transposition and conform it to a scale. And when you're happy with everything, you can just select your track, go to MIDI, freeze those MIDI modifiers. So now you've got the MIDI note data, and the same for this, just select that track and go to freeze MIDI modifiers. And now we've taken all those things that we've done and made them to be frozen into MIDI note data that we can go in and edit at a later stage. In the last few videos, I was showing you how you could use the arpeggiators in the MIDI inserts to create an arpeggiation over a section in your song. Now in this video, I want to show you how you can use the step input. Now what the step input allows you to do is it allows you to record in notes in non-real time, and it will record them to an event, and you can take your time by hitting the correct notes with the correct velocity, and then you'll play back afterwards and it plays it back perfectly in time. Now times where this will come in handy is maybe you've got a section or part that you want to play in really fast and you can't play it in real time, then you'd want to use step input. Or maybe, for example, you like programming your drums not in real time, you could use the step input to do that. Now, for demonstration purposes in this video, I want to show you how you can step input an ARP line into this. So I've got this Retrolog instrument over here, just with this patch. And I'm just going to be playing some triads. So I've got an F major to a G major to an A minor to a C major using an inversion. And then the second time around, it's an F major, G major, A minor, and then an E minor. So I'm going to jump back just a bar and I'm going to enable my click. I'm going to play it back in real time. And I'm going to show you that I can't actually really get this part done in time. And that's going to be the reason why I'm going to use step input. So here we go. So as you could hear there, my playing was really not up to scratch. It was a bit out of time, and that's why I'm going to use a step input. So to use the step input, you first need to create a MIDI event. You can do that either by going to your draw tool and drawing in an event like that, or if you've got some locators set up over here, you can just make sure you've got your arrow tool selected and you can double click and it creates the event for you. Now I'm going to double click that event. And what I need to make sure is I need to make sure that I've armed the step input. So with this armed, when I play in a note, for example, I'm just going to jump back over here. You see you've got this blue line, and if I use my arrow keys, I can jump back or forward a step. So I've got the grid set at 16th notes, and each time I move my arrow forward or back, it's jumping a 16th note. If you don't see the step input little icon over here, just go over to the gear icon and make sure that you've selected it there. You might also just want to show your quantize and your length quantize. So quantize is going to set the size of the steps, and then the quantize length is going to determine the length of the note that you put in. So for example, I'm going to show you now. I've got that armed, and I'm just going to make sure that this little blue line is at the beginning of bar 25, and I'm going to input some notes. So you can see there, I've input 3 notes, and they are on the grid of 16th note steps, with the quantize length linked to the quantize value. Now you can set these differently. Maybe, for example, you want the steps to be quarter note steps. So each time I jump the blue line, it's jumping a quarter note, but I want the quantize length to be 16ths. So now if I play in, You can see as I input a note in, it jumps to the next chord notes, but the note length is only 16th. But that's not what I want. I want the quantized value at 16ths, and then this can actually be linked. Now I'm just going to hit the arrow key to get back to the beginning of bar 25. And I just want to scroll down over here so you can see what's happening to that event. So we got this event over here. I'm going to start at bar 25, and I'm going to input my note data, and now watch what happens. So you see there, as I played in my notes, it's input them in, and step on the grid, and it's taking into account the quantized values. Now I'm going to continue with the rest. Then to the A minor. And then to the C inversion. Then back to the F. Then the G. Then to the A minor. Then to the E minor. And it's that simple. If I just zoom out, you can see there that I have recorded or record input in my whole arpeggiation. And now when I play it back, everything's going to be in time. It's going to sound much better than if I had to record it in myself. So there you go. That is how to use the step input record feature. So either you can use a MIDI insert and use the arpeggiator to create your arpeggiations, or maybe you prefer to manually record input in the notes that you want to use in the arpeggiation, then you could use this method. So choose which one suits your workflow. Sometimes you have exact idea what you want to do, then the step input is the way to go. Then other times you might want to use the MIDI inserts and the arpeggiations in there to create different types of patterns. So that sums it up for this course. I hope you've seen some new things that you can apply in your MIDI productions in Cubase. It really is a very powerful DAW that has some very advanced MIDI capabilities. So definitely dive in there and start exploring these. And if you want to learn more about Cubase, don't forget to check out some of the other video series that we also have in the Groove3 catalog.